Blood soaked through the towel pressed against his side, and still Dante Moretti would not let anyone touch him. The night had begun like any other, with Dante riding through the quiet streets in the back of his car, going over numbers with Vincent, discussing a shipment that was due to arrive at the docks before sunrise. There had been no warning, no phone call, no whisper from an informant, nothing to suggest that the road ahead had already been chosen as the place where 3 men would die. The first shots came from the left, tearing through the driver's window before anyone could react. The second wave came from behind, a car that had been following at a careful distance for longer than anyone realized. By the time it was over, the street was littered with broken glass and spent casings, and Dante was pressed against the pavement with Vincent's hand fisted in his jacket, dragging him toward whatever cover could be found. He did not remember most of the drive to the clinic. He remembered fragments, the smell of gasoline, the sound of his own men shouting numbers into radios, the particular terrible quiet that settled over a car when everyone inside understood how close they had come to not making it. What he remembered most clearly was the anger, burning through the pain, sharper than any wound, because someone close enough to know his routes, his timing, his habits, had sold that information to people who wanted him dead. The private clinic on the edge of the city had no sign on its door and no records in any system. It existed for men like him, men who could not walk into a hospital without questions being asked, without police arriving, without enemies learning exactly where to find them while they lay helpless on a table. 2 of his men carried him through the back entrance, his boots dragging streaks of red across the tiled floor, his breath coming in short, furious bursts. "Get away from me!" he growled at the young orderly who reached for his arm. The man stumbled back so fast he nearly fell. Vincent, his oldest friend and the man who had pulled him out of the car after the ambush, tried to keep his voice steady. "Dante, you're losing too much blood. Let them work. I said get away." The room fell into a strange, dangerous quiet. Dante's eyes moved from face to face, sharp even through the pain, searching for a threat, for a lie, for anyone who might be the reason 3 of his men were dead on a road outside the city. He trusted no one in that moment, not the doctor who hovered nervously by the door, not Vincent, though he had known him 20 years, not even his own hands, which shook as they pressed harder against the wound. Then the door opened, and Elena Vasquez walked in. She was not tall and she was not loud, but something about the way she moved through the room made the noise settle. She did not look at Dante with fear, and she did not look at him with the fawning caution that men in his world were used to. She looked at him the way a person looks at a problem that needs solving. "Everyone out except him," she said, nodding at Vincent. "And get me the trauma kit from room 2, not room 1. Room 1's kit is missing sutures." The doctor blinked. "Miss Vasquez, this is, I know who he is. Out." To Dante's own surprise, he did not object. There was something in her voice that cut through the panic, clawing at the edges of his mind, something steady he could hold on to. He let his head fall back against the table as she approached, gloves already on, eyes already scanning the wound with a calm that felt almost insulting, given how much blood was leaving his body. "You're going to need to move your hand," she said. "No. I can't stop the bleeding with your hand in the way. Everyone who touches me tonight has a reason to want me dead," Dante said, his voice low and rough. "Give me one reason to think you're different." Elena did not flinch. She met his eyes, and for a moment something passed behind hers that he could not read, something old and heavy, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Because if I wanted you dead," she said, "I would let you keep talking instead of working." Despite the pain, despite the fury still burning through him, something in her answer almost made him laugh. He moved his hand. She worked fast, calling for supplies without raising her voice, her fingers precise even as more blood came. Vincent stood near the door, gun still in his hand, eyes on the hallway, though everyone in the room understood there was little he could do if a real threat arrived. The clinic's walls were thin, Its location was known to too many people already. Every minute Dante spent bleeding on this table was a minute closer to someone finding him. "You're lucky," Elena said, more to herself than to him, as she worked to close the wound. "An inch to the left, and we wouldn't be having this conversation." "Lucky," Dante repeated bitterly. "3 of my men are dead tonight." Her hands paused for the briefest second, then continued. "I'm sorry," she said, and it did not sound like the empty sympathy people offered him out of fear. It sounded like she meant it, though she had no reason to. He studied her while she worked. Dark hair pulled back tight, sleeves rolled to her elbows, no rings, no jewelry that could catch or snag during a procedure. Everything about her was practical, controlled, careful. A woman who had done this before, and not just in the sterile calm of a normal hospital. There was something about the way she moved around chaos, something in how she did not startle when Vincent's radio crackled with tense voices from outside, that told Dante she had seen violence up close before tonight. "Who are you?" he asked. "Really?" "A nurse who is trying to keep you alive." "Ask me something else when you're not bleeding out." He almost respected the refusal. Almost. The procedure took nearly 2 hours. Twice, Dante's vision blurred at the edges, and twice, Elena's voice pulled him back, sharp and clear, telling him to stay with her, to keep his eyes open, to focus on her voice and nothing else. He hated how easily he obeyed. He was a man who had built an empire on control, on never letting his guard down, and yet in that room, stripped of his weapons and his men, and his usual armor of fear, he found himself following the instructions of a stranger simply because something in her tone told him he could. When the worst of it was over, when the bleeding had finally slowed and his pulse had steadied under the monitor beside the table, Elena straightened and peeled off her gloves. Exhaustion showed for the first time in her shoulders, in the way she pressed her palm briefly against her own forehead. "You'll live," she said. "Try not to make that a habit." Dante watched her clean her hands at the small sink in the corner, watched the careful, economical way she moved, even now that the danger had passed. There was a stillness to her that unsettled him more than any threat he had faced that night. Men who wanted something from him were easy to read. Fear made people transparent. But Elena Vasquez gave nothing away. "You didn't ask for money," he said. "Everyone in this city wants something from me. You haven't asked for anything." "I'm not everyone in this city." "No," he agreed slowly. "You're not." She came back to check the bandage, her fingers light against the fresh dressing, and it was then, leaning close, her voice pitched low enough that only he could hear it, that she said the word that changed everything. "Contessa." The room seemed to tilt. Dante's hand shot up and closed around her wrist before he had even decided to move, his grip hard enough that she winced. "What did you say?" Elena did not pull away, though he could feel her pulse jump beneath his fingers. Her eyes, calm only seconds before, now held something careful, something guarded, as if she had known exactly what saying that word would do and had chosen to say it anyway. "You heard me. That name does not exist," Dante said, his voice shaking with something far more dangerous than pain. "No one alive knows that name. No one. And yet I just said it." He stared at her, his mind racing through every person who had ever been close enough to know the truth buried under that word. A truth he had spent years making sure was buried deep enough that even his own men, even Vincent standing 3 feet away with his hand tightening on his weapon, did not know it existed. Contessa was not a nickname. It was not a joke. It was the one secret Dante Moretti had protected more fiercely than his own life. And this woman, this stranger with steady hands and a stranger's face, had just spoken it as easily as saying good evening. "Who told you that name?" he said, each word deliberate, dangerous. "Let go of my wrist first." "Who told you?" "Dante." Vincent's voice, cautious, from the doorway. "Your pulse is spiking. She just closed you up. Don't undo her work." Dante ignored him. His eyes stayed locked on Elena, searching her face for a lie, for a flicker of fear that would tell him she was working for someone, that this was a trap laid by an enemy clever enough to dig up his oldest wound and use it as a weapon. But there was no fear in her eyes. There was something else. Grief, maybe, or memory. "I'm not going to hurt you," Elena said quietly, and it took him a moment to realize she meant it as reassurance to him, not the other way around, as if she understood that the sound of that name had frightened him more than any blade could. "But I'm also not going to explain myself while you're holding my wrist like you're about to break it." Slowly, deliberately, Dante released her. She stepped back, rubbing the spot where his fingers had been, but she did not leave the room, and she did not call for help, and she did not look away from him. "How?" he said again, quieter now, almost pleading beneath the fury. "Do you know that name?" Elena's jaw tightened. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the soft beeping of the monitor and the distant hum of the city outside the clinic walls. "That's a conversation for when you're not bleeding through a fresh bandage," she said finally, "and when there aren't 3 other people standing close enough to hear it." Vincent's eyes narrowed. "Dante, who is Contessa?" "Out," Dante snapped, not looking at him. "All of you, now." The room emptied slowly, reluctantly, Vincent casting one last uneasy glance at Elena before the door closed behind him. And then it was only the two of them, the machines, and the name still hanging in the air between them like smoke that refused to clear. Elena crossed her arms, watching him with an expression he could not place, something between caution and sorrow. "You're not going to like the answer," she said. "I don't like anything about tonight," Dante replied. "Tell me anyway." Outside, in the hallway, Vincent stood with his back against the wall, his mind turning over the word he had just heard for the first time in 20 years of loyal service to a man he thought he knew completely. He had buried bodies for Dante Moretti. He had lied to police, to rival families, to his own wife, for the sake of that loyalty. And in 20 years, Dante had never once spoken the name Contessa in his presence. Something told Vincent, standing in that quiet hallway with his heart still pounding from the night's violence, that whatever answer waited behind that closed door was going to change everything he thought he understood about the man he had sworn his life to protect. Inside the room, Elena pulled a chair close to the table, sat down, and finally began to speak, her voice low, careful, and steady, the way it had been steady through every terrible minute of the last 2 hours. "I need you to listen to the whole thing before you say anything," she said. "Can you do that?" Dante, weak from blood loss, aching from the wound in his side, and more unsettled than he had been in years, gave a single, sharp nod. And Elena Vasquez began to tell him a story he thought no living person would ever be able to tell. "Years ago," she said, "before I worked in a place like this, I worked nights at a small clinic near the harbor. It wasn't the kind of place that asked questions. People came in bleeding, or sick, or hiding from someone, and we treated them and let them leave without writing their names on anything official. Most of them I forgot within a week, but there was one woman who came in more than once. She never gave a real name. She called herself Contessa, and she made it very clear that if anyone asked, I had never seen her." Dante's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, and Elena continued. "The first time, it was a broken wrist. She said she fell. I didn't believe her, but it wasn't my place to argue. The second time, months later, it was worse. She wouldn't tell me what happened, only that she needed to be fixed up quickly and quietly, and that if I asked too many questions, it would put both of us in danger. I remember her hands shook the whole time I worked on her. Not from pain, but from fear. I had seen frightened patients before, but never anyone who was afraid the way she was afraid, like she was counting down a clock only she could hear." Dante's eyes had gone distant, fixed on some point above her head, somewhere in the past. "She talked about her brother," Elena said quietly. "Not by name, just that he didn't know where she was, that she'd made a choice to disappear because staying near him had become more dangerous than leaving. She said if anything ever happened to her, she didn't want him blaming himself. She made me promise, if I ever had the chance, to make sure he knew that. I never thought I would. The monitor beside the table beeped steadily, indifferent to the weight settling over the room. I didn't know who her brother was, Elena continued. Not then. It wasn't until years later, after I'd left the harbor clinic and started working in places like this one, that I heard the name Dante Moretti and heard whispers about a sister no one ever spoke of, a sister who vanished and was never found. I put the pieces together slowly. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself that even if I was right, walking into your world with that kind of information would be its own kind of dangerous. "Where is she now?" Dante said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena's expression softened into something gentler, something that looked almost like sorrow. "I don't know. She stopped coming after the second visit. I never saw her again. I don't know if that means she found somewhere safe or if it means something worse. I'm sorry. I know that's not the answer you wanted." Dante closed his eyes. For years he had believed his sister was dead, killed in the same violence that had claimed so many people close to him, her body never found because whoever had taken her had made sure of it. To hear that she had been alive, frightened but alive, years after he had grieved her, was a wound sharper than the one Elena had just closed with careful, practiced hands. "Why tell me now?" he asked. "Tonight, of all nights, with a hole in my side and half the city trying to kill me." "Because you kept saying no one could be trusted," Elena said simply, "and I thought you deserved to know that one person, a long time ago, kept a promise to someone you loved, even though she had no reason to." Dante opened his eyes and looked at her, really looked at her, past the calm exterior and the steady hands, and saw for the first time the years she had carried this secret without any obligation to speak it at all. "You could have said nothing," he said. "You could have finished the surgery and let me leave without ever telling me you knew." "I could have," Elena agreed, "but I've spent a long time wondering if I made the wrong choice by staying silent. I didn't want to make that mistake twice." Outside, the city moved on unaware, sirens somewhere in the distance, the ordinary chaos of a night no different from any other for the people who did not know what had happened on that road, or in this room. But for Dante Moretti, lying on a table with a fresh wound and an old grief reopened in the same hour, nothing about the world felt ordinary anymore. The woman in front of him, a stranger 3 hours ago, had just handed him the first piece of hope he had held on to in years, and he did not yet know if he should thank her for it or fear what it would cost them both. The hallway outside the recovery room smelled faintly of antiseptic and old coffee, and Vincent paced its short length for nearly an hour, his mind circling the same unanswered question. He had grown up on the same streets as Dante, had watched him rise from a nervous young man collecting debts to the head of one of the most feared families in the city, and in all that time, he had never once heard the name Contessa spoken aloud. Not at a funeral, not in grief, not even in the drunken, unguarded hours after a difficult year when men sometimes let their oldest wounds show. Whatever this secret was, Dante had carried it alone for a very long time, and the fact that a stranger now held a piece of it unsettled Vincent more than the ambush itself. He thought of the men they had lost on the road, good men, loyal men, and the fury that thought stirred in him was sharp enough to cut through his curiosity for a while. There would be time for questions about Contessa later. Tonight, his job was to make sure there was a later at all. Vincent stood outside the clinic room for nearly an hour before Dante finally called him back in, and when he entered, he could tell immediately that something in his old friend had shifted, though he could not name what it was. "Get everyone doubled up on the perimeter," Dante said, his voice rough but steady. "No one moves in or out of this building without you knowing their face." "Already done." Vincent hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Elena, who stood near the window checking the fresh dressing on Dante's side one final time before stepping back. "Are you going to tell me who Contessa is?" "No." Vincent had known Dante long enough to recognize when a door had closed, and he did not push it further, though the question sat heavy in his chest as he left the room again to check on the men outside. 20 years of loyalty had taught him patience, but it had also taught him that Dante Moretti did not bury secrets without reason, and whatever this secret was, it had shaken him in a way that gunfire and betrayal rarely did. Elena, for her part, said nothing more about the conversation. She moved through the rest of the night with the same quiet efficiency she had shown from the start, checking his vitals, adjusting his medication, refusing to answer any further questions about herself, no matter how many times Dante tried, in careful, indirect ways, to draw more out of her. "You said you don't know where she is now," he said, near dawn, when the clinic had gone quiet except for the low hum of machines. "Did you look for her, after she stopped coming?" "I asked around, quietly, for a while," Elena admitted. "I never found anything. Eventually I told myself it wasn't safe to keep asking, not for her sake or mine." "Why would it not be safe for you?" Elena's expression flickered, something guarded passing behind her eyes before she smoothed it away. "Because people who ask questions about missing women, connected to men like you, tend to disappear themselves." It was not a full answer, and Dante knew it, but exhaustion and blood loss had finally begun to catch up with him, and his questions slowed as sleep pulled at the edges of his mind. Before he drifted off, he watched Elena move to the small desk in the corner of the room, pulling out a chart, writing notes in careful handwriting, her face unreadable in the low light. He wondered, as sleep finally took him, who exactly this woman was, and how a stranger had ended up holding the one piece of his past he had spent years searching for and never finding. When he woke hours later, sunlight was filtering weakly through the blinds, and Elena was gone. In her place sat a different nurse, older, quieter, who informed him that Miss Vasquez had gone off shift and would return that evening. Dante said nothing, but something in him tightened at the news, an unfamiliar and unwelcome feeling of being unsettled by someone's absence. Vincent returned an hour later with coffee, neither of them drank, and a report that made Dante's mood darken further. "We found the car used in the ambush, registered to a shell company, traces back to Alric Voss." Dante's hands curled into fists against the sheets. Alric Voss ran the largest rival family in the city, a man Dante had clashed with for years over territory, shipping routes, and old grudges neither of them could fully remember the origins of anymore. An attack this bold, this close to the heart of Dante's operation, was not a message. It was a declaration. "He's never come after me directly before," Dante said. "Not like this." "Someone gave him a reason to think he could," Vincent said grimly. "Someone on the inside. The route we took that night wasn't on any schedule. Only a handful of people knew it." The words settled over Dante like a second wound, deeper than the one in his side. A traitor among the small circle he trusted most was a danger far harder to treat than any bullet, because there was no way to close that wound without knowing exactly where the cut had come from. "Find out who," Dante said quietly. Quietly. "I don't want Voss to know we're looking." Vincent nodded, though his eyes lingered a moment longer on Dante, taking in the tightness in his jaw, the shadows under his eyes that had nothing to do with the long night of surgery. "This is more than the ambush, isn't it? Whatever happened last night with that nurse?" Dante did not answer, and Vincent, wisely, let the silence stand. That evening, when Elena returned for her shift, she found Dante sitting upright for the first time since the surgery, color returning to his face despite the pain still evident in the careful way he moved. She checked his wound in silence, her hands as steady as they had been the night before, though something in the air between them had changed, grown quieter, more careful, as if both of them understood that whatever had passed between them the previous night could not simply be undone. "You look better," she said. "I feel like I got shot," Dante replied, and something in his tone, dry and almost wry, drew a small, surprised huff of a laugh from her before she caught herself. "That would explain it." For a moment, the tension between them eased into something almost ordinary, something that might have passed for the beginning of comfort between two strangers thrown together by circumstance. But it did not last long. A commotion outside the door pulled Elena's attention away, and moments later Vincent burst in, his face tight with urgency. "We have a problem," he said. "One of the clinic's suppliers just canceled a delivery scheduled for tonight. No explanation given. That never happens here." Elena's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly, and Dante, watching her closely even through his own alarm, caught it. "What does that mean?" Dante asked, his eyes narrowing between the two of them. "It means someone leaned on the supplier," Vincent said. "Which means someone knows you're here." The room went cold with the weight of the realization. The clinic's location was supposed to be one of the most closely guarded secrets in the city, known only to a handful of people whose loyalty Dante had never questioned before last night's ambush. If word had reached Voss's people about a canceled delivery meant to arrive at this specific address, then the leak that had led to the ambush had not been contained. It was still active, still bleeding information, and now it had led enemies directly to the place where Dante lay recovering, vulnerable, with only a handful of men to protect him. "We need to move him," Vincent said. "He's not stable enough to move," Elena cut in immediately. "Not for another 2 days minimum. His body is still fighting infection from the wound. Moving him now could undo everything. Leaving him here could get him killed." The argument crackled between them, sharp and urgent, and Dante, caught in the middle, felt the old, familiar instinct rise in him. The instinct to take control, to make the decision no one else wanted to make. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, he found himself hesitating, his eyes moving from Vincent's grim certainty to Elena's steady, unwavering resolve. "How long can you buy me?" he asked her. "If I stay." 2 days, if we're careful. If we increase security and don't draw attention. Less if anything else goes wrong. Vincent's jaw tightened, but he did not argue further, understanding, as Dante did, that Elena's assessment came from medical necessity rather than fear. 2 days, Dante said finally. "Lock this place down. No deliveries, no visitors, nothing that wasn't already scheduled before last night." Vincent left to relay the orders, and the room fell quiet again, the tension of the last few minutes lingering in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Elena resumed her work, adjusting the IV line, checking the monitor readings, but Dante noticed the slight tremor in her hands that had not been there before, a tremor that had nothing to do with fatigue. "You're afraid," he said. "I'm careful," she corrected. "There's a difference." "Not tonight, there isn't." Elena's hands stilled for a moment. She looked at him, and for the first time since their conversation the night before, something like vulnerability crossed her expression, quickly masked, but not quickly enough for him to miss it entirely. "I've spent a long time staying out of the way of men like you," she said quietly. "Staying invisible, not asking questions, not drawing attention, not being the kind of person anyone notices. Last night, I broke that rule for the first time in years, and now there are people canceling deliveries because someone, somewhere, knows exactly where you are. If that traces back to me being seen in this room with you, it isn't just your life that's in danger." The admission hung between them, heavier than either of them seemed prepared for. Dante studied her, seeing now not just the calm professional who had saved his life, but a woman who had built her own careful, hidden existence long before he ever arrived bleeding through her door, an existence she had risked the moment she chose to whisper his sister's name instead of staying silent. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said, and he was surprised by how much he meant it, how quickly the promise had formed without his permission. "You can't promise that," Elena said. "Not tonight, not with everything closing in around us." "I can promise I'll try." It was not much, not against the danger gathering outside the clinic walls, but something in the simplicity of it seemed to reach her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them filled with everything neither was ready to say aloud. Outside, the city continued its slow slide into evening, unaware of the two people inside a hidden clinic who had, in the space of a single night, become tangled together by a name neither of them could take back, and a danger that showed no sign of loosening its grip on either of them. Later that night, after Vincent had doubled the guards along the perimeter and the clinic had settled into a tense, watchful quiet, Elena found herself unable to sleep in the small staff room set aside for the nurses on overnight duty. She sat on the edge of the narrow cot, hands folded in her lap, replaying the last 24 hours as though searching for the exact moment she had lost control of her carefully ordered life. She had built that life brick by brick, choosing jobs that kept her invisible, choosing apartments that no one remembered the address of, choosing silence over connection because silence had never once gotten her killed. And yet she had said the name. She had known, the instant Dante's men carried him through the door bleeding and furious, that this was the man Contessa had spoken of all those years ago, and she had made the choice, in the space of a single breath, to say the word anyway. She still did not fully understand why. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of carrying a secret for so long with no one to share its weight. Perhaps it was something in the desperate, controlled fear in his eyes that reminded her of the woman who had once sat on her examination table, shaking, refusing to explain her bruises, refusing to give up on protecting the brother she'd left behind. Whatever the reason, there was no undoing it now. She had pulled herself into the orbit of one of the most dangerous men in the city, and whether that had been an act of mercy or a mistake, she would not know until it was far too late to change course. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Nora, one of the other night nurses, her face pale with worry. "They're saying men have been seen near the east entrance," Nora whispered. "Not ours. Vincent's people chased them off, but no one's sure who sent them." Elena's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice level. "Has anyone told Mr. Moretti?" "Vincent's with him now." Elena rose and smoothed the front of her scrubs, forcing her hands steady through sheer will. "Then I should be there too." When she returned to the recovery room, she found Dante already sitting upright, his face pale but his eyes sharp with the particular focus of a man calculating threats. Vincent stood near the window, phone pressed to his ear, murmuring instructions to someone on the perimeter. "Tell me," Dante said, the moment Elena entered. "Two men, seen near the tree line behind the east wing," Vincent reported, lowering the phone. "Gone before our people could reach them. Could be scouts. Could be nothing." "It's not nothing," Dante said. "Voss doesn't waste men on nothing." Elena moved to check his vitals out of habit more than necessity, needing something to occupy her hands while her mind raced through the implications. If Voss's men had already found the clinic, the fragile 2-day window Elena had promised was already shrinking, and with it, any margin of safety for Dante's recovery, and for everyone inside these walls. "We need eyes on every approach to this building," Dante said to Vincent. "Not just the obvious ones. He'll come from wherever we're not looking." Already moving people into position. Dante's gaze shifted to Elena, and for a moment, the sharp calculation in his eyes softened into something quieter, something almost apologetic. "You should have stayed in the staff room. It's safer there." "Nowhere in this building is safer than anywhere else tonight," Elena said. "And you're still my patient. I'm not leaving you to face this alone because it's inconvenient for me to be nearby." Something flickered across Dante's face at her words, something Vincent noticed but did not comment on, choosing instead to slip out of the room to continue coordinating the growing perimeter of guards, now watching every shadow around the clinic's grounds. Alone again, Elena adjusted the drip on his IV line, her fingers brushing his arm longer than strictly necessary. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I don't regret saying her name, even with everything happening now." "Neither do I," Dante said, and meant it, though the weight of that truth sat heavy and unfamiliar in his chest. A small, fragile thing surrounded on all sides by danger, neither of them could yet see the shape of. Near midnight, Vincent returned with news that settled uneasily over the room. The two men spotted near the east wing had not been Voss's usual soldiers, but freelance scouts, hired hands who worked for whoever paid the most, which meant Voss was either being cautious or was testing how well defended the clinic truly was before committing his own people to an attack. Either way, it confirmed what everyone in the room already feared. The location was no longer a secret, and time was no longer on their side. "Get some rest," Dante told Vincent. "You've been on your feet since last night. So have you, and you're the one who got shot. I'm not going anywhere. Go." Vincent hesitated at the door, glancing once more between Dante and Elena, some unspoken understanding passing behind his eyes before he finally nodded and left them alone in the quiet room, the machines humming softly, the distant sound of guards shifting positions outside, the only reminder of how precarious their safety truly was. Elena pulled a chair close to the bed and sat, not because duty required it, but because she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she did not want to leave. By the third day, Dante had grown strong enough to walk the length of the recovery room without assistance, though Elena still watched him with the sharp, practiced eyes of someone ready to catch him if his strength failed. The forced stillness of recovery had done something neither of them expected. It had stripped away the roles they had first met in, the frightened boss and the guarded nurse, and left behind two people who spent long hours in close quarters with nothing to do but talk. "You don't ask about my life," Dante said one afternoon, watching her change the dressing on his wound with the same careful precision she had shown from the first night. "Most people want to know everything about a man in my position. What I own, what I control, who I've hurt to get here." "I know enough," Elena said. "I don't need the rest." "That's not an answer." She glanced up at him, a small, tired smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. "I've spent my whole career treating people who don't want to be asked questions. Gang members, runaways, men who come in with wounds they refuse to explain. I learned a long time ago that most people don't want to be defined by the worst thing they've done. They want to be treated like a person while someone fixes what's broken. And what do you think I want?" "I think," Elena said slowly, taping the fresh bandage into place, "that you want someone to look at you without flinching, and without wanting anything from you. I think that's rarer for you than it should be." Dante said nothing for a long moment, watching her work, something unfamiliar settling in his chest at how easily she had read him, a man who prided himself on being unreadable to everyone. "You're right," he admitted finally. "It is rare." He shifted against the pillows, wincing slightly at the pull of the healing wound, and Elena's hand moved automatically to steady him before she caught herself and pulled back. Neither of them commented on the small gesture, though both felt the shift it marked, a comfort growing between them that neither had invited, but neither seemed inclined to stop. "Tell me something true," Dante said, watching her organize the supplies on the tray beside the bed. "Something you haven't told anyone in this clinic." Elena considered the request for a long moment, her hands stilling on the gauze she had been folding. "I used to want to be a doctor, not a nurse. I had a scholarship lined up, everything arranged. Then my parents died, and there wasn't money for it anymore, not with the way things fell apart afterward. I told myself nursing was close enough. Most days, I believed that. And the other days? The other days, I wonder what I gave up to survive," she said quietly. "I think you understand that better than most people would." Dante studied her, seeing in her admission an echo of his own life. The ambitions he had once held before his father's death had pulled him into a world of debts and obligations he had never chosen for himself. "I was going to study law," he said, surprising himself with how easily the confession came. "Before everything, I wanted to be the kind of person who fixed things through the courts instead of through fear. My father laughed when I told him, said the law was for men who could afford to be patient, and our family never had that luxury. Do you regret it, the life you have now?" "Some days," Dante admitted. "Most days, I tell myself there was never another path, that the moment my father died, this was always where I would end up. But talking to you these past few days makes me wonder if that was ever fully true, or if I simply stopped believing there was another way." Elena did not answer immediately, and in the silence between them, something unspoken passed, a recognition of two lives shaped by loss into forms neither had chosen freely. Their conversations, in the days that followed, grew longer, drifting from careful, guarded exchanges into something closer to comfort. Dante learned that Elena had grown up in a small coastal town before moving to the city for nursing school, that she had no family left to speak of, her parents gone years ago in a car accident that she mentioned only briefly before changing the subject. He learned that she preferred quiet mornings to loud nights, that she kept a small garden of herbs on the windowsill of her apartment despite barely having time to water it, and that she had a habit of humming softly under her breath when she thought no one was listening. Elena, in turn, learned things about Dante that surprised her. Beneath the calculated coldness he showed his men, there was a sharp, dry wit that emerged when he let his guard down, and a genuine care for the people under his protection that did not match the reputation whispered about him across the city. He spoke, carefully and rarely, about the years after his sister's disappearance, about how the search for her had consumed him until he had finally been forced, by grief and by the demands of running his family's business, to accept that she was gone. "I stopped looking 3 years ago," he told Elena one evening, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "I told myself it was because there was nothing left to find, but the truth is, I was afraid of what I'd find if I kept searching. I didn't know if I could survive learning the details of how she died. And now you know she might have been alive, at least for a while, after you stopped." "Now I don't know anything," Dante said, frustration bleeding into his voice. "I have a name from a woman who came to you 2 years ago and never returned. I don't know if she's alive, I don't know if she's safe, I don't know if telling me any of this was a mercy or a cruelty." Elena reached out, an instinct she did not fully examine before acting on it, and rested her hand over his where it gripped the edge of the blanket. "I've thought about that too, since the night I said her name. I keep asking myself if I gave you hope or just reopened a wound that had finally started to close. I don't have an answer. I only know that I couldn't keep pretending I didn't recognize you the moment they brought you through that door." Dante turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers loosely intertwining, a small gesture that felt far larger than its size in the quiet, charged air between them. "Whatever it cost you to tell me," he said, "I'm grateful, even with everything else happening around us." The moment stretched, fragile and unfamiliar, until the sound of raised voices in the hallway shattered it entirely. Elena pulled her hand back, and Dante's expression hardened instantly, the guarded boss replacing the man who had just spoken so openly. Vincent burst through the door moments later, his face tight with barely controlled anger. "We have a problem inside the clinic." "What kind of problem?" Dante demanded, already reaching for the robe draped over the chair beside his bed. One of the supply staff was caught making a call outside, away from the building, where he thought no one could hear him. My man got close enough to catch part of it. He was giving someone details about this room, your condition, how many guards are posted, and where. The air in the room went cold. Elena's hands stilled on the tray of supplies she had been organizing, her eyes flicking to Dante, whose jaw had gone tight with barely restrained fury. "Who?" Dante said, his voice dangerously low. "Marco," Vincent said. "He's worked here for 2 years. Nobody thought twice about him." Elena's stomach dropped. She had worked alongside Marco countless times, had trusted him to restock supplies, to keep the clinic running smoothly during long, difficult nights. The idea that he had been feeding information to Voss, possibly for months, made her feel sick with a betrayal she had not expected to feel this personally. "Bring him to me," Dante said. "Dante." Elena's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension. "You can barely stand without support. Whatever you're planning, you're not doing it alone. And you're not doing it here, with this many people who could get hurt in the crossfire." "She's right," Vincent said, though it clearly cost him to agree. "We need information from him, not a scene. Let me handle this quietly." Dante's fury was a visible, physical thing, radiating off him even as his body, still weakened from surgery, betrayed the limits of what he could actually do in that moment. He looked at Elena, saw the steady insistence in her eyes, the same insistence that had kept him alive through the first terrible night, and felt some of the fire in him bank, not extinguished, but controlled. "Find out everything he knows," Dante said finally. "How long he's been talking, what Voss knows about this location, and find out if there are others." Vincent nodded and left immediately, already calling for 2 of the guards stationed near the front entrance. Elena moved to Dante's side, gently guiding him back toward the bed despite his obvious reluctance to sit still while danger closed in around them. "This changes things," Dante said, more to himself than to her. "If Marco's been talking for months, then Voss doesn't just know I'm here. He's known things about my operation for far longer than I realized. This isn't just about the ambush anymore." "What does that mean for us?" Elena asked quietly. And the word us, small and unplanned, seemed to hang between them with a significance neither fully acknowledged. "It means," Dante said, "that whoever is working against me isn't finished. And it means I need to be strong enough to face what's coming, faster than my body wants to allow." Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing the medical reality against the danger gathering outside these walls. "I can push your recovery, within limits. But if you tear that wound open moving too fast, you won't be strong enough to face anything." "Then help me find the balance," Dante said, "because I don't think we have the luxury of choosing between healing carefully and surviving what's coming." Outside, in a small, windowless room at the back of the clinic, Vincent's men were already extracting the first pieces of a truth that would prove far more dangerous than anyone in that recovery room yet understood. A truth that would soon make clear just how deep the betrayal against Dante Moretti truly ran, and how little time remained before it exploded into violence none of them could contain. Elena, watching Dante's face as he wrestled with the weight of everything unfolding around them, felt the fragile warmth of the last several days settle into something firmer, something that felt, despite every reason it should not, like the beginning of trust between 2 people who had both spent years believing trust was a luxury they could not afford. An hour later, Vincent returned, his expression grim in a way that told Dante the news would not be simple. He closed the door behind him before speaking, his voice low. "Marco talked. He's been feeding information to Voss's people for almost 4 months. Small things at first, delivery schedules, staff rotations. Then it grew. He gave them the route for the night of the ambush. He's the reason 3 of our men are dead." Dante's hands tightened on the edge of the blanket, knuckles going pale. Why? What did Voss offer him? Money. A lot of it. Enough to disappear somewhere far from here, start over under a different name. Vincent's jaw tightened. He said he didn't think anyone would actually die. Said he thought it was just information, nothing more. "Information got 3 men killed," Dante said, his voice a low, dangerous thing. "And nearly got me killed as well." "I know." Vincent hesitated, glancing briefly at Elena before continuing. "There's more." He confirmed, "Voss knows you're recovering here. He doesn't know the full layout, but he knows enough." Marco described the East Wing, the number of guards posted, roughly how long you've been unable to move quickly. Voss has been waiting, gathering information, deciding when to strike. Elena felt the blood drain slightly from her face. Every quiet, careful day of recovery they had spent inside these walls, believing themselves at least partially safe, had been observed and reported by someone they had trusted enough to overlook entirely. "How long before he moves?" Dante asked. "I don't know," Vincent admitted. "Could be tonight. Could be a week from now, if he's still gathering intelligence. But we can't assume we have time we don't have." Dante closed his eyes briefly, the fury and exhaustion in his face aging him by years in the span of a single conversation. When he opened them again, the softness that had lingered from his earlier conversation with Elena was gone, replaced by the sharp, calculating focus of a man once again fully aware of the war closing in around him. "Increase security on every entrance," he said. "Assume Voss knows everything Marco knew. Change the guard rotations. Change the routines. Anything that might buy us an advantage if he does move soon." "And Marco?" Dante's expression darkened further, but the answer that came was quieter than either Vincent or Elena expected. "Hold him. I'll decide what happens to him once I know we've survived whatever comes next. Right now, I need every resource focused on keeping this building standing." Vincent nodded and left to carry out the orders, and once again the room settled into a tense, uneasy quiet. Elena moved to Dante's side, checking his pulse out of habit, though her mind was clearly elsewhere, turning over the sudden, terrible knowledge that danger was no longer a distant possibility, but something actively gathering just beyond these walls. "I'm not leaving," she said, before he could suggest it. "Whatever is coming, I'm not walking away now." "I wasn't going to ask you to," Dante said quietly. "I don't think I could, even if it was the safer choice for you." The admission sat heavy and honest between them. Unpolished by the careful walls either of them usually kept around such truths. And in the tense hours that followed, as Vincent's men moved through the building reinforcing every weak point they could find, Dante and Elena remained close, bound now by more than a shared secret, bound by the growing certainty that whatever happened next, they would face it together. The attack came just before midnight, 3 days after Marco's confession, when the clinic had settled into the careful, watchful rhythm that had defined the last stretch of Dante's recovery. It began with the lights. Every bulb along the perimeter fence flickered once and went dark, plunging the grounds into a heavy, unnatural black that made the guards' radios crackle with confused, urgent voices. Vincent was already moving before the first shot rang out, years of instinct pulling him toward Dante's room, even as gunfire erupted somewhere near the east entrance, exactly where Marco had described the weakest point in the clinic's defenses. "They're here," Vincent shouted, bursting through the door. "Get him up, now!" Elena was already moving, pulling the IV line free with practiced speed, ignoring Dante's protest as she looped his arm over her shoulder to help him to his feet. His body, still healing, still not fully his own, moved slower than he wanted, frustration and adrenaline warring across his face as the sound of gunfire grew closer. "There's a safe room," Vincent said, already leading them toward the hallway. "Reinforced walls. One door. We hold there until we know how many we're dealing with." The hallway outside was chaos, shouting men and the sharp, acrid smell of gun smoke beginning to drift through the building's ventilation. Elena kept her grip firm on Dante's arm, guiding him forward even as her own heart hammered against her ribs, every instinct screaming at her to run, while another, stronger instinct kept her exactly where she was, refusing to abandon him even now. A window shattered somewhere behind them, and Vincent spun, firing twice into the darkness before shoving both of them forward. "Move, now!" They reached the safe room seconds before a group of Voss's men rounded the corner into the hallway they had just left, and Vincent slammed the reinforced door shut, throwing the heavy bolt into place as the first impact of fists and gunfire struck the other side. The room shuddered but held, the walls thick enough, at least for now, to withstand the assault. Inside, the small space was cramped, lit only by a single emergency light casting long shadows across the concrete walls. Dante sank onto the narrow cot along one wall, pain and exhaustion finally catching up to him now that the adrenaline of the escape had begun to fade, while Elena knelt beside him, checking the fresh strain on his wound with hands that shook despite her best effort at composure. "You're bleeding again," she said, pressing gauze against the spot where the wound had reopened from the strain of moving so quickly. "It'll hold," Dante said, though his voice was tight with pain. Outside the door, The sounds of fighting continued, muffled but unmistakable. Gunfire and shouted commands and the occasional heavy impact against the reinforced walls that made Elena flinch each time. Vincent stood near the door, weapon raised, listening intently to the chaos beyond, his jaw set in grim concentration. "How many?" Dante asked. Hard to tell. Sounded like at least 8, maybe 10, when they hit the east entrance. Our people are pushing back, but they came prepared. This wasn't a scouting run. This is Voss trying to finish what he started. Dante's hands curled into fists against his knees, frustration burning through the pain. "I should be out there." "You'd be dead in the first minute," Elena said sharply. "You can barely stand. This is exactly why he waited until now to strike. Because he knows you're weak, and if you walk out that door, you're doing exactly what he wants." The truth of her words settled over him, bitter but undeniable, and for a long, tense moment, the three of them remained still, listening to the battle raging beyond the reinforced door, each gunshot a reminder of how close the danger truly was. Then, without warning, the lights in the small room flickered and died, plunging them into darkness broken only by the faint glow of the emergency exit sign above the door. "They found the backup generator," Vincent muttered. Someone knew exactly where to look. In the sudden dark, Elena felt Dante's hand find hers, gripping tightly, and she realized, with a strange, sharpened clarity, that despite the danger surrounding them, despite everything unknown waiting on the other side of that door, she did not want to be anywhere else. Whatever happened next, she would face it beside him. The pounding against the door grew louder, more deliberate, and Vincent's voice, when he spoke, carried an edge of genuine alarm for the first time since the attack began. "They're trying to breach the lock. This door won't hold forever." "Then we need another way out," Dante said, forcing himself upright despite Elena's protest, his voice regaining some of its old command even through the pain. "Is there one?" Vincent's eyes darted around the small room, searching. "There's a maintenance passage, behind the shelving. Leads to the old boiler room, then out through a side exit that isn't covered by the main perimeter. It's a long shot, but it's something." "Take it," Dante said. "Get Elena out first." "I'm not leaving without you," Elena said immediately, her voice fierce despite the fear evident beneath it. "There's no time to argue," Dante said, but even as he spoke, Vincent was already pulling the shelving unit aside, revealing a narrow, dust-covered passage barely wide enough for a single person to pass through at a time. "We go together, or not at all," Elena said, and something in her tone left no room for further argument. Dante, weakened but unwilling to waste precious seconds fighting a battle he could not win in that moment, gave a sharp nod. "Together then. Move." The passage was tight and dark, forcing them to move slowly, Dante's breath ragged with the effort of pushing his still-healing body forward, while Elena stayed close behind him, one hand braced against his back to help steady him whenever he stumbled. Behind them, the sound of the safe room door finally giving way echoed through the passage, followed by shouted voices and the heavy thud of boots against concrete. "They're in," Vincent said grimly, quickening his pace. "Move faster." They emerged, minutes later, into the old boiler room, dust thick in the air, pipes groaning faintly overhead in the darkness. Vincent led them toward a rusted side door, easing it open just enough to check the grounds beyond before waving them forward into the cool night air. The side exit opened onto a narrow strip of overgrown grass bordering the edge of the clinic's property, shielded partially from view by a row of trees that had grown wild over the years. For a moment, it seemed as though they might make it clear, the sounds of battle fading slightly behind them as they moved quickly through the darkness. Then a shout rang out from somewhere to their left, and Elena's blood went cold as she realized they had been spotted. "Down!" Vincent barked, pulling both of them behind the nearest tree as gunfire erupted, bullets tearing into the bark inches from where they crouched. Vincent returned fire, his movements precise despite the chaos, buying them precious seconds as Dante pulled Elena further behind the cover of the tree, his body angled protectively in front of hers despite his own weakened state. "Stay down," he said, his voice rough with urgency and something else, something raw and protective that neither of them had time to examine in the moment. The exchange of gunfire lasted only seconds, though it felt far longer, before the attackers' shots went silent, replaced by the sound of a body falling somewhere in the darkness. Vincent's breathing was heavy but steady as he checked the area, confirming the immediate threat had passed, at least for now. "We need to keep moving," he said. "There will be more." They made their way through the trees, Dante leaning heavily on Elena now, his strength finally beginning to fail under the strain of the escape, until they reached a narrow service road where one of Vincent's men waited with a car, engine already running. They climbed inside quickly, and the car pulled away into the night, leaving the sounds of the ongoing battle at the clinic fading slowly behind them. Inside the car, the adrenaline that had carried them through the escape began to fade, replaced by exhaustion and the sharp, lingering fear of how close they had come to not making it out at all. Elena checked Dante's wound in the dim light, relief washing through her as she confirmed the bleeding, though worse than before, was not immediately life-threatening. "You saved my life tonight," Dante said quietly, watching her hands work with the same steady focus she had shown from their very first night together. Again. "You did the same for me," Elena said, "standing between me and gunfire when you could barely stand on your own." "I wasn't going to let anything happen to you," he said simply, and the truth of it, plain and unguarded, settled between them with a weight that neither the danger nor the exhaustion of the night could diminish. Vincent, watching from the front seat, said nothing, though the look on his face made clear that whatever had grown between his old friend and the quiet, steady nurse over these past several days had become something neither of them could easily walk away from now, not after a night that had bound them together through violence, betrayal, and the fragile, stubborn hope of survival. As the car carried them further from the wreckage of the clinic, toward a safe house Vincent had long kept in reserve for exactly this kind of emergency, Dante allowed himself, for the first time since the ambush that had started everything, to believe that perhaps survival was not the only thing waiting for him on the other side of this war. Beside him, Elena's hand remained in his, steady and warm, a small, unshaken point of certainty in a night that had otherwise offered them none. The safe house sat at the end of a quiet, unremarkable street, a modest two-story building that drew no attention from anyone passing by, exactly as Vincent had designed it years earlier, for moments precisely like this one. Inside, the rooms were sparse but clean, stocked with enough supplies to last several days without needing to risk a single trip outside. Vincent secured the doors and windows methodically, checking each lock twice, before finally allowing himself to lower his guard enough to speak. "We lost 4 men tonight," he said quietly, the weight of the number settling heavily over all 3 of them. Voss lost more, but that won't matter to him. He'll regroup and come again, harder next time. Dante, seated now on a worn couch in the small living room, his face pale with exhaustion and pain, absorbed the news with a grim, steady silence. Casualties on both sides. He'll frame it as a victory regardless, because he forced us to run. Then we make sure the next time he comes, running isn't the only option, Vincent said. Elena, kneeling beside Dante to redress the wound that had reopened during their escape, listened to the exchange with a growing unease she could not quite name. She had spent years staying carefully outside the reach of conversations like this one, conversations about violence and retaliation spoken as casually as if discussing weather, and yet, sitting here now, having run through gunfire and darkness beside these 2 men, she found she could not summon the same detached distance she once relied on. "How many more people have to get hurt before this ends?" she asked quietly, not accusing, simply tired. Dante's eyes met hers, and something in his expression softened, weighed down by more than physical exhaustion. "I don't know. I wish I did. This isn't a war I chose, Elena." It found me the moment my father died and left this life in my hands. But I won't pretend it doesn't cost people around me more than it should. Would you walk away from it, if you could? The question hung in the quiet room, heavier than either of them expected. Vincent, sensing the private nature of the moment, quietly excused himself to check the perimeter one final time before the night fully settled, leaving the two of them alone with the weight of a question that had no simple answer. "I don't know anymore," Dante admitted finally. For years, the answer was no, because walking away meant abandoning everyone who depends on me, everyone who stayed loyal through worse nights than this one. But lately, since you walked into that room and said a name I thought no one alive remembered, I've started wondering if there's a version of my life I haven't let myself imagine yet. Elena finished securing the bandage and sat back on her heels, studying him in the dim light of the safe house's single working lamp. That's a dangerous thing to wonder, in the middle of a war. "Most things worth wondering about are dangerous," Dante said. "I've learned that from you, this past week, more than from anyone in a long time." The quiet between them settled into something gentler than the fear and adrenaline of the night before it. A fragile understanding neither of them fully voiced, but both clearly felt, strengthened rather than broken by the violence they had just survived together. Vincent returned a short while later, his expression carrying news that pulled both of them sharply back into the reality of the war still surrounding them. "One of our men reached me. Marco is dead. Voss's people got to him during the attack, before we could move him to a safer location. Looks like Voss didn't want him talking to anyone else." Dante's jaw tightened. He silenced his own informant. "Cleaner that way, for him," Vincent said grimly. "No loose ends. But it confirms something else. Marco wasn't working alone. Whoever helped him get close enough to overhear scheduling details, someone still inside our organization gave him that access. We haven't found them yet." The news settled over the room like a fresh wound, deeper somehow than the physical one still healing beneath Elena's careful bandaging. Dante closed his eyes briefly, the exhaustion of the night compounding with the fresh understanding that the betrayal within his ranks ran wider and deeper than a single supply worker acting alone. "Find them," Dante said, his voice quiet but unmistakably firm. Quietly. "I want to know who else has been listening before Voss finds another way to use it against us." "I'm already on it," Vincent said, and with that, he retreated once more to continue his watch over the safe house, leaving Dante and Elena alone again in the dim, uneasy quiet. "This isn't over," Elena said softly, more statement than question. "No," Dante admitted, "it isn't. But whatever comes next, I don't intend to face it the way I faced everything before you walked through that door. Alone, trusting no one, waiting for the next betrayal, instead of building something worth protecting." Elena reached for his hand again, her fingers steady despite everything the night had put them through, and in the fragile silence of the safe house, surrounded by the lingering danger of a war far from finished, something quietly, stubbornly hopeful took root between them, refusing to be extinguished by everything still working against it. 3 weeks passed before the city finally grew quiet again, though quiet, in Dante Moretti's world, never meant safe. Vincent's investigation into the leak within their ranks led, eventually, to a young courier named Lucas, a man who had joined the organization only a year earlier, and who, under pressure of gambling debts, had agreed to pass small pieces of information to Marco in exchange for enough money to keep his creditors quiet. Unlike Marco, Lucas had not known the full weight of what his information would be used for, and when confronted, he had broken down entirely, confessing everything he knew about how deep Voss's reach had extended into Dante's world. The information Lucas provided, combined with what Vincent's people had gathered in the weeks following the attack on the clinic, gave Dante what he needed to move decisively against Ulrich Voss. It was not a war fought entirely in the open, but through a careful, calculated dismantling of Voss's operations, cutting off his supply routes, exposing his own informants within Dante's world before he could use them further, and finally, in a tense meeting brokered by neutral parties from outside both families, forcing Voss into an uneasy truce that neither side fully trusted, but both understood was safer than continued open war. The meeting that finally secured the truce took place in neutral territory, a quiet restaurant closed for the evening, at the request of the brokers who had arranged it. Men from outside both families who had no interest in seeing the city's fragile order collapse into open war. Dante arrived with Vincent at his side, his body fully healed now, though the memory of that first terrible night never fully left the careful way he still moved. Alric Voss was older than Dante remembered from the few occasions their paths had crossed years earlier. His hair gone gray at the temples, his eyes sharp and assessing as Dante took the seat across from him. "You survived my best effort," Voss said, without preamble. "I'll admit, that surprised me." "You underestimated how much I had left to protect," Dante replied evenly. Voss studied him for a long moment, something calculating behind his gaze. "Marco gave us good information. Lucas too, before he lost his nerve. I'm curious what changed. You've run your operation the same careful way for years. What made you vulnerable enough for me to get this close?" Dante did not answer immediately, unwilling to give Voss the satisfaction of understanding just how deeply the events of the past month had reshaped him. "Careless men get exploited," he said finally. "I've since fixed that carelessness, permanently." The negotiation that followed was tense, precise, both men aware that a single misstep could reignite the violence that had already cost both families dearly. In the end, the truce settled on familiar terms, an agreement on territory, a mutual understanding regarding shared shipping routes, and a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that further open conflict served neither of their interests. It was not trust. Men like Voss and Dante did not deal in trust. But it was enough to allow the city, and everyone caught within its careful, dangerous balance, to breathe again. Walking out of the restaurant afterward, Vincent fell into step beside Dante, his expression thoughtful. "You handled that better than I expected." "I had a good reason to want it settled quickly," Dante said. "Every day this dragged on was another day Elena was in danger because of me." Vincent glanced at him, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You've changed these past weeks. I don't think I've ever seen you fight this hard for a truce instead of a victory." "Maybe I've finally learned there's more worth protecting than territory," Dante said quietly. And Vincent, wisely, said nothing more, letting the words settle between them as they made their way back through the quiet, watchful streets of the city that had so nearly taken everything from both of them. It was not a clean victory. It never was, in this world. But it was survival, and for Dante, survival with Elena beside him through every difficult decision had come to mean more than any clean victory ever could have. She had stayed close through it all, through the tense weeks of rebuilding security, through the careful, quiet negotiations that eventually brought a fragile peace, through the long nights when Dante's frustration and grief over his sister's uncertain fate resurfaced in quiet, unguarded moments only Elena ever witnessed. She had not asked for a place in his world, had never once suggested that she wanted to be pulled deeper into the violence and danger that defined his life. And yet, somehow, without either of them planning it, she had become essential to it, a steady presence he found himself unwilling to imagine his life without. On a quiet evening, weeks after the worst of the danger had finally passed, Dante found Elena on the small balcony of the house he had moved into temporarily while the damaged clinic underwent repairs, her eyes fixed on the city lights spread out below them. "I've been thinking about Contessa," he said, joining her at the railing. Elena turned to him, her expression careful, watching for whatever weight this conversation might carry. "What have you decided?" "I want to keep looking for her," Dante said, properly this time. "Not the frantic search I gave up on years ago, but something patient, something careful. I have resources now I didn't have before, connections in places I never thought to look. If she's alive, I want to find her. And if she's not, I want to finally know the truth, instead of living the rest of my life wondering. That sounds like the right choice, Elena said softly. Whatever the answer turns out to be. I want you with me, when I start, Dante said, the words coming easier than he expected. Not because you owe me anything. You've already given me more than I ever thought to hope for, just by telling me the truth that first night. But because I've realized these past few weeks that I don't want to face any of this, the search for her, the rebuilding of everything Voss tried to destroy, any of it, without you beside me. Elena's eyes softened, the careful guardedness she had carried through years of staying invisible, finally, quietly, giving way to something more open. I told you once that I've spent a long time staying out of the way of men like you. Staying unseen, uninvolved, safe in my own careful distance from danger. I remember. I don't think I want that anymore, she said. Not after everything we've survived together. Not after realizing what it feels like to matter to someone the way I seem to matter to you. Dante reached for her hand, the same steady, careful hand that had first closed his wound on the worst night of his life, and found it just as steady now, though the fear that once colored her touch had given way to something far gentler. I loved my sister more than anything in this world, he said quietly. For years, believing her dead was a grief I carried alone, because I didn't trust anyone enough to share it. You gave me back the possibility that she might still be out there, and in doing that, you gave me something I didn't know I still needed, which was permission to hope again. Not just about her, about everything. That's a lot of weight to put on one whispered name, Elena said, though her voice was thick with emotion rather than doubt. It's not just the name, Dante said. It's everything since. The way you stayed, even when staying meant running through gunfire beside me. The way you never once asked me to be anything other than exactly who I am, even knowing everything that means. I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who wanted something from me. You never have. Not once. Elena stepped closer, closing the small distance still remaining between them, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, over the place where the wound, mostly healed now, still marked the beginning of everything that had brought them here. I didn't come looking for this, she admitted. I came into that clinic that night to do my job, the way I've done it for years. I never expected any of this to happen. Neither did I, Dante said, but I'm grateful it did. The city lights spread out below them, indifferent to the quiet moment unfolding on the small balcony. The same city that had nearly taken everything from both of them, now serving as a distant, glittering backdrop to something neither had believed themselves capable of building. A fragile, hard-won peace, grounded not in the absence of danger, but in the presence of someone willing to face it together. In the weeks that followed, Dante's search for his sister began in earnest, careful and patient, guided by every fragment of information Elena could remember from those two visits so many years earlier. It would take time, perhaps longer than either of them wanted to imagine, and there was no guarantee the search would end in the reunion Dante had spent years grieving the loss of. But for the first time since his father's death had pulled him into a life he had never chosen, Dante Moretti faced the uncertain road ahead without the crushing isolation that had once defined every difficult decision he made. Vincent, watching the change in his old friend over those weeks, found himself quietly grateful for the woman who had walked so unexpectedly into their world, even as he remained watchful, as always, for the dangers that still lingered at the edges of the fragile peace they had built. Voss's truce, he knew, would not hold forever. Men like Voss rarely let old grudges rest for long. But for now, there was room to breathe, room to rebuild, and room, however unfamiliar it felt, for something as unguarded as hope. One afternoon, Vincent found Elena alone in the rebuilt clinic's new supply room, organizing inventory with the same careful precision she brought to everything else. He lingered in the doorway a moment before speaking. I wanted to thank you, he said, For what you did that first night. And every night since. Elena looked up, surprised by the directness of it. You don't need to thank me. I only did my job. You did more than your job, Vincent said. I've known Dante most of my life. I've watched him build walls around himself so thick I stopped believing anyone would ever get past them. Then you walked in, said a name that shouldn't have existed, and somehow, in a matter of weeks, I'm watching him fight for peace instead of vengeance. That's not something your job asked of you. That's something you gave him, freely, when you had every reason to stay out of it. Elena set down the box she had been holding, considering his words carefully. I almost didn't say it, you know. That first night, I stood there, watching him bleed, and I told myself it wasn't my place, that whatever I knew about his sister wasn't mine to share. I don't know what finally made me say it anyway. Whatever it was, Vincent said, I'm grateful for it, both for his sake and honestly for mine. It's exhausting, watching someone you care about carry that much weight alone for that many years. The conversation stayed with Elena long after Vincent had gone, a quiet confirmation of something she had already begun to feel in the weeks since that first terrible, transformative night. That whatever fear had first driven her to speak Contessa's name, the choice had rippled outward in ways far larger than she could have anticipated, touching not just Dante, but everyone who had spent years watching him carry his grief in isolation. Elena moved into Dante's world slowly, deliberately, on her own terms, never losing the careful independence that had first drawn his attention on that terrible first night. She continued her work, though now within a clinic rebuilt stronger and safer than before, and she remained, always, the steady presence Dante had come to rely on through every difficult turn since the night she had leaned close and whispered a single word that changed the course of both their lives. On the anniversary of that night, months later, Dante found her again on the same small balcony, the city lights spread out below just as they had been that first quiet evening together. Do you ever regret it? He asked. Saying her name that night and everything it led to. Elena turned to him, a small, certain smile touching her lips. Not for a single moment. Some names change everything, once they're spoken. I think I always understood that hers would, the moment I finally said it out loud. Dante drew her close, the weight of the past months, the danger survived, the truths finally spoken, settling into something steady and lasting between them, a bond forged not in the absence of the violence that surrounded his world, but in the quiet, stubborn courage of two people who had chosen, against every reasonable instinct, to face that world together rather than alone. And as the city lights glittered below them, indifferent and eternal, Dante Moretti finally allowed himself to believe that whatever came next, whatever dangers still waited in the shadows of the life he had inherited, he would not face them without the one person who had never once wanted anything from him, except the simple, extraordinary gift of being seen. 6 months after the truce with Alric Voss quieted the streets, a letter arrived at Dante Moretti's office, unsigned, delivered by a courier who claimed only to have been paid in cash by a woman who did not give her name. Inside was a single photograph, worn at the edges, and 3 sentences written in handwriting Dante recognized instantly, though he had not seen it in over a decade. His hands trembled as he read the words, and for a long moment he could not speak. Vincent, standing nearby, saw the change in his friend's face and crossed the room quickly. Dante, what is it? It's her, Dante said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's Isabella. The name, spoken aloud for the first time in years, the real name behind the code name Contessa, carried a weight that filled the room entirely. Vincent took the photograph carefully, studying the woman in the image. Older now, her face weathered by years Dante had not been present for, but unmistakably his sister, alive, standing in front of a small house somewhere, with a garden visible behind her. Where was this sent from? Vincent asked. There's no return address. Just this. Dante held up the letter, his hand still unsteady. She says she's been careful, all these years, watching from a distance. making sure it was safe before reaching out. She says she heard, somehow, that things had changed. That I wasn't the same man who once made her feel like leaving was safer than staying. He looked up, eyes bright with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. She says she heard I found someone who reminded her that hope was still possible. She wants to meet Elena. Elena, who had been quietly working in the next room, appeared in the doorway at the sound of her name, drawn by the unmistakable shift in the air. When Dante turned to her, letter still trembling in his hand, she understood immediately. "She's alive," Elena said softly, crossing the room to him. "She's alive," Dante confirmed, and for the first time since the night Elena had first spoken that impossible name in a room thick with fear and blood, he allowed himself to weep, not from grief, but from a relief so profound it left him unable to hold back the tears any longer. Elena wrapped her arms around him, holding him steady the way she had held him steady through every difficult night since, and Vincent, respecting the moment, quietly excused himself, leaving the two of them alone with a joy neither had believed themselves capable of feeling again after everything the past year had put them through. It took another 3 weeks of careful, patient communication, letters exchanged through the same anonymous courier, before Isabella finally agreed to a meeting. She chose the location herself, a small cafe in a town several hours from the city, far enough removed from Dante's world that she could still feel safe, close enough that the journey did not feel impossible. Dante and Elena arrived together on a cool autumn morning, the cafe nearly empty at that early hour, sunlight slanting gently through the windows. Dante's hands had not stopped shaking since they left the city, a nervous energy Elena recognized from every difficult night they had faced together, though this fear carried none of the danger of those earlier months, only the raw vulnerability of hope finally within reach. Isabella was already seated when they arrived, a cup of tea untouched in front of her, her eyes finding Dante's the moment he stepped through the door. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the years of separation and grief and uncertainty hanging between them in a silence too heavy for words. Then Isabella rose, and Dante crossed the room in 3 quick strides, and the embrace that followed carried within it every year of loss they had both endured separately, every fear, every quiet, desperate hope neither had dared to fully believe in until this exact moment. "I thought you were dead," Dante said, his voice breaking. "For years I believed I'd lost you. I thought staying away was the only way to keep you safe," Isabella said, tears streaming freely down her face. "I was wrong to let you believe I was gone. I know that now. I'm sorry it took me this long to come back." They sat together for hours that morning, Isabella slowly filling in the years Dante had missed, the careful, isolated life she had built for herself, far from the danger that had once threatened them both, the constant fear that had kept her from reaching out, even as the years passed, and the ache of separation grew heavier. She spoke of the harbor clinic, of the frightened, careful nurse who had treated her without judgment and kept her secret, even when she had no obligation to. "I never forgot her kindness," Isabella said, turning to Elena with an expression full of gratitude too large for simple words. "I didn't know, until recently, that the promise I asked her to keep had finally reached you. I'm grateful, more than I can say, that she chose to keep it." Elena, quiet through most of the reunion, finally spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "I've thought about you often, over the years, wondering if I'd made the right choice, staying silent as long as I did. I'm glad to finally know you found your way to safety." "Because of you," Isabella said, "he finally found his way back to hope. I don't think I could ever repay that." As the afternoon wore on, the conversation turned lighter, filled with careful laughter and the slow, tentative rebuilding of a relationship both siblings had feared lost forever. Dante watched his sister with an expression Elena had never seen on his face before, unguarded and openly joyful, years of grief finally beginning to loosen their grip on a man who had carried that weight alone for far too long. Isabella chose, in the weeks that followed, to remain at a careful distance from Dante's world, unwilling to risk the safety she had built for herself over the years. But the two of them maintained contact now, letters and careful, occasional visits replacing the silence that had defined the past decade. It was not the reunion either of them might have imagined in easier circumstances, but it was enough. A fragile, precious connection restored after years both had believed permanently lost. Vincent, when he finally met Isabella himself several weeks later, greeted her with the same quiet loyalty he had shown Dante for 2 decades, promising, without being asked, that her safety would remain a priority for as long as he had any say in the matter. Isabella, in turn, thanked him warmly, recognizing in him the same steady devotion that had clearly carried her brother through the darkest year of his life. "You kept him alive," she told Vincent, "long enough for all of this to become possible. I hope you know how much that means to me, even after all these years apart." "He would have done the same for me," Vincent said simply, and the two of them shared a brief, understanding smile. Two people who had each, in their own way, helped hold together the fragile threads of a family nearly lost to violence and silence. On the drive back to the city that evening, Dante reached for Elena's hand, holding it tightly as the countryside gave way slowly to familiar streets. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, "for everything, for that first night, for every difficult day since, and now for this." "You don't need to thank me," Elena said softly. "Watching you with her today was thanks enough." "I mean it," Dante said. "You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever. My sister, yes, but more than that. You gave me back the belief that good things are still possible in a life like mine. I don't know how to repay that kind of gift." Elena turned to him, a quiet, certain smile touching her lips. "Then don't repay it. Just keep choosing hope, the way you have these past months." "That's all I could ever ask for." The city lights came into view as the car crested the final hill before the long descent toward home, familiar and glittering and, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, no longer defined solely by danger. Dante Moretti, a man who had spent years believing trust was a weakness he could not afford, found himself instead surrounded by it now, in the loyalty of the friend who had stood beside him through every difficult battle, in the sister who had finally found her way back to him after years of careful, painful silence, and in the steady, unwavering presence of the woman who had first whispered an impossible name in a room thick with fear, and in doing so, had changed the entire course of his life. Whatever dangers still waited in the shadows of the world he had inherited, whatever battles remained to be fought in the uncertain years ahead, Dante faced them now with something he had not possessed on that first terrible night. A reason beyond obligation and survival, a life worth protecting not out of duty, but out of a hope he had once believed himself incapable of holding on to again. And as the car finally pulled into the quiet street where their new life together had slowly, carefully begun to take shape, Elena's hand still warm in his, Dante allowed himself, fully and without reservation, to believe that the worst of his story had finally given way to something far better, a future built not on fear, but on the quiet, extraordinary courage of two people who had chosen each other in the darkest possible circumstances and had never once looked back.